You're listening to Big World Network.
Skyfire, Season 2, Episode 6, written and read by Arthur W. Johnson. Seamus pulled his foot out of the sucking mud of the prairie swamp and took another step. He looked at Bright Moon with an expression of apology and said, Elliot was right about needing a good rest before coming to this. We ought to go back and wait for the spring floods. He added a laugh to show Bearclaw that it was only a jest. Yup, Bearclaw said, except we'd miss another whole winter's pelts. They slogged on away before Bearclaw added, You are going to go north and run trap lines with me, ain't you? In her own tongue, Bright Moon repeated the words of the shaman, Beware of the man with the scarred face, for he is evil. The shaman also thought I had a brother, Seamus reminded her in Potawatomi. In English, she said to Bearclaw, I hadn't given it any thought. I suppose we could. Sure, and why not? But we need to find an easier way to get to market next year. We'll leave it at the right time for the floods. That's easy to figure. Hey, there it is, Seamus said with excitement. In the near distance lay the sparkling ribbon of the Chicago River, beckoning them to be free of the prison of mud. Over there, Bearclaw nodded with his shaggy head. That looks like the shortest way. Their feet sucked in and out of the mud with renewed energy. At Seamus's bidding, Bright Moon was the first to sit in the canoe and clean the mud from her legs in the fresh water while the men held the canoe steady. Seamus took his turn while Bearclaw braced the bow. When he was done, Bearclaw tumbled into the canoe, not caring if he wallowed in the filth for the rest of the trip. They arrived at Kinsey's as the sun was sneaking off to sleep, but James Kinsey, owner and proprietor, was still open for business. A few of the local Potawatomi and Ottawa still lingered, half-drunk, sipping at what their government annuities would buy, not willing to sober up and wait for the next payment. Seamus opened the door and heard the conversation as he entered. I tell you, Elijah, if we can pull this off in Congress and we get this canal to the Illinois River, we're going to all be rich men. Why, just think how big this town will be. Instead of 150 people, we'll be thousands, and they'll name streets after those of us who were here first. Think of it, man. Hubbard Street for you, Kinsey Street for my pa and me. Turning to the new arrivals, he said, Howdy, strangers, what can I do for you? Bearclaw hiked up his muddy breeches and said, Got a mess of beaver pelts to sell. You interested? Yep, there's still a fair market for 'em. Good, we'll bring 'em in. Bearclaw led the way back to the canoe. As they re-entered the store, Kinsey was saying, But we'll need a harbor for lake shipping. The storms get too treacherous for anchorage while the bateaux shuttle back and forth. Turning back to the trio, he said, Let's see what you've got. Kinsey untied the bundles and went through the pelts, uttering from time to time. Finally, at the end of the second bale, he said, That's what I like, an honest trapper. One who doesn't try to slip in a few rabbit and squirrel pelts to make up the difference. I don't always go through 'em this thoroughly, but since you're new to these parts, I had to find out what you're made of. You keep packing 'em like this and we'll both prosper for as long as there's a market. Bearclaw winked his good eye at Seamus, who missed the gesture among the confused features of his face. James Kinsey went on, These are pretty nice pelts. Where'd you trap 'em? North, Bearclaw said, up near the west end of the lake the Chippewa called Kitchigami. By the way, with Black Hawk on the rampage, we daren't go back to the Mississippi. You know of any other rivers between here and there? Well, Kinsey thought a minute as he waved goodbye to Elijah Hubbard. I've got an old surveyor's map. Don't know how much good it is since it's kind of old, but it's better than nothing. He reached up to the back of the top shelf and retrieved a roll of paper 3 feet long. Spreading it open on the plank counter and weighting the corners to keep it flat, he said, It's 40 or 50 years old now, drawn by French voyagers as they called themselves. Let's see. He pointed to the legend at the bottom corner. Here it is, 1788. Can't make out the name. Now you're looking for the western end of Lake Superior. He looked up. That's the same as Kitchigami. He traced the shoreline with a finger and stopped at the western end, which was about as far as the map was drawn. That look about right? Bearclaw bent over the map and compared the streams to those he remembered during the winter of trapping as best his lack of education would allow. Yeah, I suppose so. Where are we now? Kinsey tapped the map with a rounded fingernail at the site of Chicago, and the two began tracing rivers and streams with their eyes. Seamus and Bright Moon looked on with interest. Finally, Kinsey pointed at a river and said, Right here near St. Martin's Island. Looks like this'll be the least amount of portages, but you're going to have to do some paddling. Would you be willing to sell me this map? Bearclaw asked. Can't do that. You see, it's the only one I have. Tell you what you can do, though, he said, bending to reach under the counter. Here's some brown wrapping paper and some charcoal. If you care to take the time, I'll let you copy what you need from it. I'll do it, Seamus interrupted. I've got one question, though. How do we get from here to St. Martin's Island? That's a long stretch of lakeshore to follow in a canoe with heavy water all around. Heavy water, Kinsey said, sizing Seamus up. Sounds like you've done a little sailing. Aye, I have, he said as he bent to the task of sketching the rivers. I worked my way over here from Ireland a few years ago aboard a snow. You may be in better luck than you thought. A friend of mine owns and captains a barkentine that he runs from here to Detroit. Several of his crew are down with the Og right now, so the Western Lady is sitting at anchor. Captain Furnell said last night that if he had just one more man, he could set sail. Seamus's eyes lit up. He had enjoyed his short-lived career as a sailor. You come back in here tomorrow morning and I'll introduce you. He comes in around 10 o'clock to chew the fat when he's in town. They were agreed and about to leave when Kinsey added, By the way, the Western Lady usually calls in at St. Martin Island, right where you want to disembark. Robert Furnell stood at the railing with his arms folded across his broad chest. The brown in his high-collared sweater would have blended with the deep tan of his face if the graying whiskers on his square jaw had not separated them. The gray stopped just above his ears as though the top of his head belonged to a much younger man than the bottom. He held a reserved smile as he welcomed them aboard, glad to be able to get under way. But the furrows on his forehead spoke his concern for the unknown seamanship abilities of this young Irishman with the Indian wife. Swing the davits out for the canoe, he ordered in a deep voice. As the two crewmen leapt to obey, Seamus dropped his bundle and descended to secure the lines to the bow and stern of the birch-bark craft. You can stow your gear over there, the captain said to Bearclaw and Bright Moon, pointing at a space between some of the crates near the mizzenmast. Appreciate you giving us passage, Captain, Bearclaw said as Seamus reappeared on deck. Thank him, not me, he said, nodding toward Seamus. Hope you can do all you say, young feller. Farther north we go this time of year, the rougher it'll get. All I can do is my best, Captain. I hope it's good enough. Who does the schooner belong to, he asked, nodding toward the nearby ship. Captain Napier and his brother John owned her. I sailed with them a few years ago out of Ohio. Now they've brought their families here and sold the telegraph to someone local. She hasn't moved since. Captain looked doubtfully at Bright Moon, who was staring at the ship and her trappings in wonder. Well, anyway, he said, some of the sick should be well before we get to the rough waters. He cupped his hands to his mouth and bellowed, Lay out the sails, lads, weigh anchor, and let's get under way. He turned to see shock in Bright Moon's face. Perhaps she had never heard anybody bellow before. He looked at Seamus and said, Well, don't just stand there, you're part of the crew now. Bright Moon's head swiveled from man to man across the deck and up into the rigging. She had never seen so many men move at once at one man's beckoning. She could feel the deck begin to move and was amazed that this house in the water could pick up speed like a well-paddled canoe. As the captain had predicted, his men were able to return to their duties one by one. Seamus was glad of that, for the captain's other prediction had also come true. The going was getting rougher. He realized that the captain's years of experience on these great lakes were invaluable. It was obvious he had sailed nowhere else. He had become completely attuned to the seasons of the waters like a carpenter is accustomed to his tools. He knew how to use every wave and every gust to his advantage. Later, as they shared the wheel, Captain Furnell shouted above the wind, snapping canvas. If my guess is right, I'll be wanting to grab the wind as soon as we reach St. Martin and head east through the Mackinaw Straits ahead of the gale-force winds. Seamus looked at him blankly before the captain clarified for him. It means something different for both of us. For my ship and me, it means survival. The gale could dash us on the rocks in the straits, and in order to stay ahead of it, I may not have time to call in at St. Martin's. But Seamus was knocked sideways by an unexpected gust from port. As he regained his footing, Captain Furnell reached out and grabbed his elbow, steadying him back at the wheel. See what I mean? Already the winds are shifting around. I'll lower you within sight of the island, though, and you should have plenty of time to make land before it hits. They fought the shifting wind as though on tacking course for a while. Finally, Captain Furnell yelled above the wind, You've been a great help and proven yourself well. I wouldn't mind keeping you on permanently. Seamus smiled his gratitude and strained his arms the harder.
Music by Kevin MacLeod.
You're listening to Big World Network.